Welcome to Between Two Psychs, a podcast where two psychologists and Board Approved Supervisors deep dive into many of the questions and challenges that provisional psychologists and early career therapists face in everyday practice, during training, throughout the internship, and beyond as they progress into working more independently. Your hosts, Isabelle Tombleson and Claire Trevitt, talk about a range of topics, specifically relating to psychologists and therapists who are just starting out.
Morning.
Good morning.
Hi, Claire.
Hi, Isabelle. Back again.
Hi. All right, let's tell everyone what we're going to be talking about today. This is an episode that is going to explore difficulties in supervision. So today we are going to talk about the types of things that can go wrong in supervision, preparing for problems in supervision, what you can do about it if you find that there are problems, working out how you can have difficult conversations with your supervisor if it is safe to do, and some steps for how to do that and suggestions for how to do that. And yeah, I think we'll just get into it.
Yes, I think this is a topic that's very important to both of us, being supervisors. And unfortunately, while I think that we all have an expectation that supervision is going to be a supportive relationship and a supportive experience, it isn't always the case. And I think preparing for that and just being aware of, I guess, when to listen to your own intuition around when things feel a little bit off.
Yes, that's right, Claire. We hear stories from other supervisees, and just from being psychologists ourselves and having gone through supervision ourselves, we know that it's not always done perfectly. So let's first talk about the type of things that can go wrong.
Yes. I think the first thing I want to really acknowledge here is that there is a power differential here between the supervisor and the supervisee. And so therefore, when there is a difference in opinion, which may occur, then it may be assumed that the supervisor is really going to have the final stand here. So if you're in a position where you have quite a strong sense of where you're learning, what your understanding of the code of ethics, what you've learned clinically is pretty much aligned with what you're doing, and then that becomes questioned. It may just be that there's a gap in your learning, but also sometimes supervisors may not necessarily have all of the adequate training and experience in all of the areas. And sometimes the way that you're proposing to go about something may actually be the correct way. So I guess it's not wanting to doubt yourself or necessarily doubt your supervisor, but being aware that there may be differences, but also maintaining an open mind about that.
I like what you're starting with here, Claire, because what you're identifying is that it's really normal across practitioners for us all to have slightly different opinions and approaches to how we do things. And so if you're in a situation where you're a provisional psych, you're in a placement, or you've got a principal supervisor, they are responsible for helping you to attain this qualification, which you've worked so hard for. And it can be really common that we take that submissive approach to supervision. We see them as being the authority. And so then, yes, it can make us question if we've got different ideas or opinions about things, and like working out how to balance and take on the suggestions and ideas of our supervisor. But if something is feeling off and we're thinking like that's actually not right, that would maybe be an example of when you need to think about, is this an example of when something is going wrong for me here?
Absolutely. And I think what I would say there to add on to that is that it's going to be the response of your supervisor that will probably impact what happens next. So, for example, I may have a supervisee that says to me, I was taught this in uni, or I was under this understanding. And as a supervisor, I might say, you know what, I hadn't thought about that perspective, or actually maybe that's some new research I wasn't aware of, or yes, I can see where you're coming from there, but actually this way here may actually address those issues in a more comprehensive way and explain why.
We'll have a rationale, and we'll even have some literature to back up usually if we are going to suggest someone does something different to how they've been taught or trained previously. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so we can get through those discussions quite easily, but it's when you end up with a supervisor where you're feeling as though there's a complete mismatch, but the communication isn't there to actually work through this. So that would be probably the first thing that I would be looking out for is, can you take things to your supervisor? Are you
Mm.
feeling that they're listening to you, hearing your perspective? Do you feel safe and comfortable being able to ask those questions? And so that would probably be the first thing that I think could go wrong in the supervisory relationship.
Oh, and that covers a lot really of what can go wrong because, like, fundamentally, if the relationship isn't there in terms of like safety or you're not feeling respected in that relationship, which means that you should feel comfortable to bring things up, even if it's a bit uncomfortable, that would be, yeah, a big warning sign, wouldn't it?
Yes, I think so, because even when you're completing tasks for the internship, which might be like observations of your practice, that's pretty daunting to give somebody a recording. And when I'm sure you're the same, Isabel, but when I'm actually looking at through these recordings and reviewing, I'm trying to really think about balanced feedback. I want to really try and build confidence. I also want to give value and to give some maybe feedback that's constructive or is going to actually help the person learn. But again, if you are in a situation where you're feeling maybe criticized, put down, then really thinking about that supervisory relationship needs to really be supportive in order to enhance your growth.
Yep, yep. And let's think about it, right? If we're not feeling safe in our supervisory relationship, we're probably going to be having an autonomic nervous system response, some sort of fight or flight response that's going to put us into a state of dysregulation. We're not going to be the best version of ourselves if that's the case as well. Like our prefrontal cortex will be switching off. We're probably not going to be able to put our sentences together properly or remember things that we should be able to remember. Like a whole wave of problems comes up when we're not safe. Yeah. So your learning may suffer.
Yes, it really might. And so it is looking for that support. At the same time, you do have a responsibility as a provisional psych to be completing various tasks. And if your supervisor's coming onto you and saying, I can't sign your logbooks, sorry, I can't sign your logbooks unless they're complete, or I can't complete your progress report until your logbooks and your reflections are complete, or we're behind on certain things, there is a responsibility. So sometimes it might feel your supervisors, because sometimes I feel like I'm doing this. There are certain tasks to complete. So it is that balance between what's your responsibility and what's your supervisor's responsibility. And ultimately that should be spelled out ideally at the beginning with some kind of contract so you know what your responsibility is and what their responsibility is, because they can't do things for you, but they really can guide you through that process.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so there can be a number of things that can go wrong in the supervisory relationship. A couple of other things that we'll touch on as well, just to highlight for everyone listening. If you're noticing that there's aggression, like outright aggression, that would be a big red flag that there's something going wrong in that supervisory relationship that shouldn't be happening at all. If there's organizational problems, so if supervisor is not coming to supervision or changing supervision around a lot, or you're just not getting supervision or adequate supervision. So if you're on a placement somewhere and the supervisor is also running the practice and they've allocated time for you, but oh, sorry, we can only do 5 minutes today because I've got to go and do X, but is still signing you off for an hour or something like that's totally unethical and shouldn't be happening and is so not great for your learning. So yeah, logistical organizational problems and then ethical concerns. If you're noticing that there's some maybe some behaviors from the supervisor that aren't in line with our code of ethics, that would be something definitely going wrong. And then Claire, you mentioned, and I didn't think of this, like problems with payment, funding, financial aspects of the supervisory relationship. So sometimes we are paid in a practice when we're on placement and the supervisor owns the practice. So how does it work when you're an employee? And that's like that dual relationship stuff that can actually make things quite complicated as well.
Yeah, and it is a dual relationship, and that really should be nutted through initially, so that there's a sense of, okay, yes, there's a responsibility that the supervisor might have to the business, but there's also the responsibility that the supervisor has as a supervisor. And sometimes they can become quite merged, whereby it becomes about the needs of the business. And one example I see where I see this happening quite frequently or hear about it quite often is where supervisees are expected to see a large number of clients in a day, maybe 6 or 7 clients in a day, and then there's 1 hour allocated to admin, which invariably involves various meetings and what have you, and then they're told that their time management is the issue and that business really needs this funding. And that is really, that's not ethical for the supervisee, even though it meets the needs of the business. And so those supervisors, I think, do have sometimes a very difficult job, particularly if they're employees. So it's not necessarily their business, but sometimes it can be quite tricky and not necessarily the supervisor's decision. But all of those things, again, it's how that gets worked through, because the placements do need to be ethical and sustainable. And if a supervisor is instrumental in making that placement and the conditions of that placement not sustainable, then that's a real problem.
Yes, it is. And so, as you can tell, Claire and I come across these problems, and that's why we are sharing them with you. And so, we are now going to talk about what you can do about it. So, there's just some examples. We might not have covered all of them, but just some examples of when things can go wrong. What are we going to do if there is something going wrong? Now, Claire, you wanted to bring this up first. We need to assess if it's safe to do something. So, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Ideally, if there is an issue with a supervisor, like you're concerned about something ethically, you're concerned about the conditions you're working under, you're feeling as though your needs in supervision are not being met, for example, these are all really legitimate conversations that you might want to have with a supervisor, and you could have with a receptive supervisor. But if you're feeling as though it's not safe, for example, you're feeling emotionally unsafe, as though that's going to be too challenging for you, and you're going to be met with maybe some kind of aggression or potentially some kind of threat. And by threat, maybe a threat to your employment, or maybe a threat for a report to APRA, which I know I've seen this happen before, and unfortunately I've come across cases where supervisees have felt under threat of a report to APRA for not meeting various ethical requirements, even though those requirements really don't fall in under the realm of ethics. And I'm talking about things like being in a placement where you're seeing 7 clients a day and therefore not able to keep up to date with case notes, and those sorts of things are not actually possible for the person, and then being called out for not meeting those requirements and not keeping records up to date when the conditions of the employment are not allowing for that. So it does need to be safe. You do need to feel that you are going to have a receptive audience, and feel that your supervisor, whether it's your workplace supervisor and or your primary or secondary supervisor, whoever you're needing to address this with, is going to create an environment that would be conducive to this.
Absolutely. So, yes, so the other thing I wanted to add to that is sometimes the threat is also really passive as well. And that's still, we would still call that aggressive, but sometimes it can be really subtle. And so you might not pick up on it first. But if you have that uneasy feeling in your gut and you know that you're not feeling safe, but you can't quite pinpoint why, that could still be an example of when you're being coerced, when you're trying to bring up things with that supervisor, or if you're feeling like you're not safe to bring up things with your supervisor because you've noticed that pattern of behaving maybe with them already.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point too, because sometimes it's not so overt, is it? Not so feeling it.
Yeah. Okay, so if it's not safe, what do we do?
If it's not safe, it's not sustainable. So one of the things, I know in some ways it feels like a cop-out for me to say this, but I would suggest that you really reevaluate whether or not you can exit that situation towards a situation that does feel safe. If you're feeling as though the issue is actually a reportable issue, and sometimes I've come across situations where it has most definitely been reportable, unfortunately, where it is a very clear breach of ethical guidelines. And because normally, if there is a breach of ethical guidelines or we're concerned around something, we would contact that person and have that conversation with them, give them the opportunity to correct that So an example of that might be a psychologist might have testimonials on their website, and somebody might contact them and say, did you know that's actually a breach? We're not allowed to have testimonials from clients as clinicians. And while we should all be aware of that, sometimes people would say, I actually wasn't aware of that, but I'll take them down. And then the issue's been addressed. But if they continue to breach that, then there are grounds to put in a complaint to AHPRA, which will eventually usually go to the HCCC.
Yeah.
So if it's not safe to have that conversation initially, then it may be that a report does go to AHPRA. And if that is the case, I'd recommend that you do that with a secondary supervisor, or at least somebody that you know, an experienced clinician that would support you with that. You really want to get your facts straight before you do anything like that.
So having the support of someone who I guess is experienced, so maybe if you have a secondary supervisor, but if you don't, seeking out someone, a co-worker or a colleague, ideally someone who's in the same profession as you to help guide you would be really great.
Yes, and if you are going to make some kind of complaint and you think it's serious enough, you do need some kind of written evidence as well, because it's very difficult to then take that further if you don't have some evidence of that. If you do have concerns and you start to feel this isn't feeling right, just looking at any correspondence that you've got or anything that would help support your claim. Ultimately, we are responsible as clinicians, including as provisional psychologists, to ensure that our colleagues, and that may include supervisors, are actually acting in accordance with the Code of Ethics and are safe for the public. It really is about protection of the public registration. So we really do have a duty to make sure that we are reporting anything that really is deviating from that code.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And just because we might be in like that's perceived like submissive relationship because we are needing something from this person, it doesn't, that we're still a registered provisional psychologist and we have that responsibility. It's a great way to frame it actually, because it equalizes that relationship straight away.
Yeah, it does, but often it's not felt that way when you're the one receiving supervision. Then, and particularly when you're gathering your knowledge, because as a provisional psychologist, you are, or an early career psychologist, you don't know as much as you will when you've got 20 years experience. You can't condense 20 years into 1 or 2 years.
Yeah. I really like what you said, and I just want to highlight documenting everything. And this applies even just for employee-employer relationships. There's a lot of overlap here, and people might be even thinking, oh, I've had bosses like this, not necessarily my supervisor. So yeah, really important skill is to start to document things if your intuition is telling you that there's something off. Be prepared to have some things jotted down, some dates and some times of things, other people who may have been present, and the nature of the things of what been said, of what have been said, or even copies of emails, copies of SMSs, things like that can be really valuable for that complaint process, but also just to maybe help you to process and make sense of what's going on, so that when you do seek support from someone else to evaluate, am I just imagining this or is this actually happening? That will be super helpful as well.
And you were saying, Isabelle, that when it is safe, there can be some things that we might be able to support provisionals with as well, because sometimes we're giving the worst case scenario here, but if you do have a supervisor who you feel may be receptive, even though it feels scary, there are some ways that we can have these conversations.
There are, and this is my favorite thing to talk about with any of my new supervisees, is getting us comfortable having uncomfortable conversations with people who we perceive to be having authority over us. So this could be a supervisor, it could even be an employer or a more experienced clinician that you work alongside with. So learning how to have uncomfortable conversations is really great early on. I just want to plug that if you have a supervisor who encourages you to provide feedback on them after supervision, that is a great way to build up skills in providing honest feedback to your supervisor on what the supervision session was like for you. And I just want to highlight, if you're a supervisor listening to this, I encourage using a feedback form at the end of every supervision session so that you can train your supervisee to start to get comfortable with telling us if we're getting it right. So that could be the beginning of it. But if you are finding that you maybe need to practice this skill, there are a couple of things that you could start with. So we've already mentioned it before. Find someone that you can feel safe to talk it through with, a secondary supervisor, another colleague, another coworker, whoever it might be in your situation. And you want to talk it through so that you can work out, like, this is the lay of the land. This is what I'm observing. They might help to ask some open questions to help you develop a richer understanding of the situation that you're in. From there, you might want to make a list of the things that you'd like to be addressed. In an ideal world, if there was no fear holding me back here, what would be the things that I would love to bring up with the supervisor? And prepare that list, write it out. And then consider weighing up the pros and cons of bringing up each of those items on your agenda. And consider like the potential outcomes as well. So see if you can use your imagination to predict or just evaluate, like, how might things go if I do bring this up? And again, with the pros and cons, how does that affect me as well? Am I going to be okay if this outcome happens? And from there, you might want to consider your next steps. Am I going to approach the person and practice having this challenging conversation, or is it not safe? And then you would go the other way, where Claire and I have previously guided you. But if you think that the relationship is respectful enough, and if you're feeling really brave and you want to practice this skill, what I suggest you do is role play it with someone, with the person that you're talking it out with. Role play how you might perform the conversation. And it so doesn't matter if all your words or if you get it wrong. The idea is that if your brain has had an experience of practicing the conversation, your brain doesn't really necessarily know the difference between the real situation or the practiced one. Your brain just knows that it's had that conversation. So it's very important to practice it. And if you don't have anyone to role play it with, just talk to yourself. If you're driving in the car to work, no one knows if we're talking on our mobiles these days, like with the Bluetooth. Just talk to the road as you drive. I can say that I've done that. Talk it through, practice how you want to have the conversation. Your brain will feel better and safer because that scariness will hopefully have been worked through as you've practiced it a few times, and your brain will adapt. Then the other thing is that you might want to decide, am I going to do this face-to-face, or am I going to do it by email or text or a phone call? And it's totally up to you to decide how you feel safest to do it. Email is great because then it's all documented. You've got an accurate record of the conversation, but sometimes some of the nuances can be missed in email or in SMS. So I probably wouldn't recommend it. Like, if this is a supervisor who you are meeting face-to-face, either video conference or actual face-to-face, have a go of having the tricky conversation with them in person. And then be prepared for what are your deal breakers. So there's a good chance your supervisor might want to negotiate with you. They might say, okay, I hear you. I'm hearing that you're saying this. How about this? Let's say, for example, you've got too many clients on your caseload. They've given you 6 or 7 clients a day, and you're experienced, so you could maybe meet that need, but it's actually totally inappropriate. So you say to them, look, this is where I'm at, and where I draw the line is I need to see 5 clients a day. And let's say they come back to you and they say, okay, look, I hear that you want to see 5 clients a day. How about you see 7 clients and make a really big, like 10-hour day on this day, and then you only need to do a half day the next day, and you've got the rest of the day for admin. That's just one sort of way of think, like, where am I going to draw the line? Am I willing to negotiate? And how far am I prepared to negotiate? And the other thing is, like, say, thank you, like, I've heard you. Is it okay if I think about it? So I'm not going to give you an answer right now. I really appreciate you taking the time to hear me out. I'm going to go away. I'm going to think about it, and I'm going to come back to you at this time with my response. And then you're not under pressure. The other thing is, if you do accidentally agree to something, that's fine. But can you put a clause in? Okay, I'll agree to this, but can we review in a week or 2 weeks? I want to have a chance to evaluate whether I'm happy with this new plan that we're implementing. I've talked a lot. The top tips. Claire, I can see you nodding and smiling. Do you want to share your thoughts?
I just think they're great. They're really good tips there, because you are not committing yourself to anything. It's tentative. So you're not necessarily having to have this conversation and feel as though if it didn't go the way you wanted, that you've actually got to accept everything. The only thing I might add there is that if you are a little bit nervous about talking to your supervisor, you could always send a little email to say, look, there are a few things that I'd like to talk to you about. Some of this is going to be a bit hard for me to say. Just sound them out to see whether or not they seem receptive to that idea, because their response to that might also give you a sense of whether or not you can feel more at ease having those conversations, whether you actually get a response, what the response might be, how receptive that they might be. If you do have a really receptive conversation with your supervisor, then that's likely to actually really enhance the supervisory relationship. And so that's where it can be really helpful to be brave enough to have those conversations. But it does take a level of courage to do that. And with the power differential, we're acknowledging, I would encourage people, of course, to have those conversations with me, and I would hope that people would be receptive. And I've had those conversations with people before where they've said, I feel like my needs will be better met in this way, or I feel that like this sometimes in our sessions. And I will say, thank you. I'm glad you've let me know that. But I'm aware that isn't always the response that you might be given. And so while I would say, look, you can wholeheartedly guarantee that I will be as receptive as I can possibly be to this, you may not always get that response from others, and we've got to be really honest about that. But there's some great suggestions there. So
I love the email suggestion. Yeah, like approaching the topic before that face-to-face confrontation. That's really great. And like you said, a great way to further evaluate your safety in that situation.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
We've covered everything that we wanted to share with everyone today, so we'll leave it here.
Yes, thank you. It's been a topic that has been on our mind for a while, and hopefully it's been helpful.
Yeah. Okay. Bye, Claire.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave us a 5-star rating. It really helps others find the show. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Between Two Psychs for more updates and resources. For more information and to explore everything we offer, head over to our website, betweentwopsychs.com.au. We appreciate your support, and we'll see you next time.